On this super live review, we're going to take a look at the Moondrop Super Spaceship Pulse, also known as the Moondrop SSP, which, if you missed my unboxing, well, kind of an unboxing video I did about a week ago, this is the follow-up to Moondrop's Super Spaceship reference, the SSR. Now, SSP versus SSR, what's the difference? Well, P stands for pulse, which ostensibly means they're going for a bassier sound here, whereas the R was going for more of a neutral sort of reference tune. Well, they've gone with a more, I think, consumer-friendly sound here. And I think a lot of people are actually pretty excited about this one for a couple of reasons. One, well, I really like the Moondrop SSR. I did find that its tuning was a little bit niche, I think we could say pretty safely, but a lot of things to really like about just like the build quality, the aesthetics, the fit, and you know, apart from the tuning, there was some really nice things about that sound. And so I think a lot of people are interested in an earphone like that maybe has a tuning that's a little bit more for everybody. And I mean, we'll get into that, but I think that's what they've done here with the Moondrop SSP. One thing I wasn't sure about during the last video, but I am sure about now, the SSP is going to come in at the same price as the SSR, so 40 bucks. So for 40 bucks, you get your option of sort of a reference-ish tune, sort of a neutral tune earphone, or something a little bit more traditional, with a little bit more bass. I think that's pretty cool that Moondrop has kind of set themselves up like that. Some other things worth talking about this thing. I mean, it's a single dynamic driver earphone, 40 bucks, so it's not expensive. This is definitely on the budget end. But as we're gonna see, some aspects about this build I think definitely are better than the price. But yeah, I've spent the last week or so living with this earphone, comparing it directly to the SSR, which I still have, and frankly, that's still an earphone I go to pretty often. But I've also compared it a little bit with the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus, which I think falls in a similar price range, just to find out which of these earphones is my personal favorite, which of them do I think is going to be your favorite, and yeah, I don't know, just try to figure some things out. So this is a live review. If you're watching now, if you're in the live stream and you got questions about either the SSP, the SSR, the Tin T2 Plus, anything I talk about or anything I don't talk about, if you got questions, leave them in the live chat, and at the end of this review, we'll have a little quick Q&A conversation. If you're watching this as a VOD, you probably missed out on the Q&A. I'm sorry, but if you want to be around for the next Q&A, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell. YouTube will let you know when I'm live. And I go live kind of sporadically like this, right? What is it, 6 p.m. on a Sunday evening, California time? Yeah, anyway, if you want to be part of the next live stream, please subscribe and ding the bell. Otherwise, if you're just here for the review, let's dig into it. So, like I typically do, I'm going to start by talking about the build and the physical aspects of this earphone, which, like I alluded to, there are a lot of really positive things about this that I think carry over from the Moondrop SSR. And just for reference, just for reference, I do have the Moondrop SSR sitting here, but for now, we're going to put that one aside and focus on the SSP. So, what you get here, and in case you're not familiar with the SSR, I'll just kind of start from the beginning. What you get here is a really just shockingly small IEM. In fact, I should have had the wherewithal to bring in something of comparable size just for reference, but in case, well, here we go. I've got this. Here's a set of AirPods, and here is the Moondrop SSP, just to give you a sense of how tiny this little earphone is. This is not the AirPods Pro, this is the original AirPods in the little itty bitty AirPods case. And the SSP, I think, looks pretty minuscule next to it. Now, why does that matter? I think having a minuscule size like this, one, means that this thing's gonna fit into, I think, most people's ears. You know, IEMs, I don't really have an issue fitting most IEMs, but I know that there are different ear shapes out there, and different IEMs are going to fit people differently. Some people's ears just kind of keep them out from being able to try certain IEMs, and I think the SSP, like the SSR, is going to be one of those fits that just works for pretty much anybody. You do have a relatively long stem here, and the way that this thing fits, basically, the tip will enter my ear canal, and that's about the only part of this thing that touches my ear. The rest of it just kind of hangs out in space inside the bowl of my ear. And that wasn't supposed to be a goofy space reference, but you can deal with that if you want. Yeah, I mean, real quickly, I'll show what this thing fits like so you can see how minuscule it is in the ear. So not only do I think that this minuscule size is going to work for a lot of people, very tiny, right? Not only do I think the small size is going to work for a lot of people, I think it also has the side effect of making it comfortable and a really good sleeping earphone. If you don't sleep in earphones, that might seem like a weird thing. I also sleep in my watch. Don't at me. But I sleep in earphones all the time, and I find that this shape, the SSP and the SSR, is one of my absolute favorite sleeping IMs. Just a really nice, easy to live with shape. I can sleep on my side, and just I don't have any comfort issues. So there's the shape and fit. Other things we can talk about though that I like about this thing is one, these shells, they might not look it. I don't know if you could tell, but these are in fact a metal shell. Let's see if we can give it a little clink test. So these shells are built out of solid metal, and here on the SSP, they are painted in this kind of like matte, almost like a powder coated finish that I think is really freaking handsome. You know, color-wise, I gotta say I kind of prefer the white color here on the SSP as well as the silver that they've got as well. I kind of like those colors maybe a little bit better, but the coloring here on the SSP, I was talking about the SSR, the coloring here on the SSP I think is pretty nice, and really I much prefer the matte finish to the glossy finish on the other ones. You do also get this little gold accent here in the screw, and that is a real screw. If you want to take these things apart, these things are very easy to take apart. I'm not going to demonstrate that, but trust me. But yeah, so you got the metal shells. I think they're handsome. And then the other thing that I really like about the build of this earphone and the SSR is this cable, which again, it might not feel like it looks especially nice, but just look at how easy that lies flat on the table. Like, it doesn't fight me at all. It's not stiff. It's not too floppy. It's just, I think it's like the perfect softness level for a cable. And it's very thin, you know, it doesn't feel especially substantial, but I think for such a small earphone like this, that's totally fine. And I think that just overall, you have a really, really well-behaved cable that I don't really have any issues with tangling. I don't have any issues with it fighting me. And, you know, here's this one I've had since whenever the SSR second came back on sale. I've had this one for a few months, and, you know, it's still a good looking cable, still holding up. So I like that. And then we can talk real quickly about the tips, which, just full disclosure, the tips that I have here on my SSP are not the stock tips. These tips are from these are basically Finals E-type tips. And I put these on here for one main reason. The stock tips are fine, but I found that I was able to get a more consistent seal with a grippier tip like the SSP here, or sorry, like the Final tips right here. And that for me was important because I was bouncing back and forth between these two different earphones, and I needed to get just an easy seal. So that's kind of why I've got these Final tips on here. I do find that the Final tips are a very good match for the SSP as well as the SSR, and I also like Asla's Sedna tips, or even like the Zelastec tips. I think are a pretty good match, but the stock tips are fine too. And, you know, at that point, you're kind of talking about tips that cost almost as much as the earphone itself, because again, let's not forget, this is a budget earphone. So that is basically as much as I can say about the physical aspects of the SSP. Quite like it. Maybe I quite love it. Frankly, like the SSR, and I gotta say, it's the same thing here with the SSP. Despite it being a $40 IM, this is just about my ideal physical form of an IM. I think the only IM that I really like significantly better in terms of build is something like the Shozy CP or maybe the Maga OC-K5, which are just, they're a little bit more molded for the inside of your ear, and they take up more space in your ear, so they will isolate it maybe a little bit more than you'll get with something like this. The isolation here in the SSP is about average, but I don't know, there's just, For 40 bucks, this is outstanding, and I think even if this thing costs like 10 times as much, 10 times? That might be overshooting a little bit. Even if this thing costs like 5 times as much, I would still think that the build was pretty solid. So that's the build of this IM, but here's what you care about. You care about the sound. I assume you care about the sound, and so we're gonna talk about the sound signature here of the Moondrop SSP. And again, if you missed my first look video, in that video, I actually did a live frequency response graphing of the SSP versus the SSR. And with that frequency response graph, you could just very clearly see that there was a lot in common between the SSP and the SSR, but the big difference, kind of as Moondrop promises, is in that bass response. And there is a significant increase in the bass frequencies here on the SSP versus the SSR. Not just in the graph. I have, again, since listened to this thing for about a week, and I can confirm that there is, that bass comes through. So frequency response wise, or just kind of like the overall tonal signature, you go from something like the SSR, which was quasi-reference tune, like kind of a neutral sound signature, but with a very significant upper mid-range lift, to something that's a little bit more traditional in terms of, you know, this is not a neutral sound signature anymore. This is still got that same upper mid-range lift, but now you've got a very significant bass boost, which is kind of a wideband bass boost, right? That bass boost doesn't just focus on the sub-bass frequencies. It kind of starts a little bit early and ramps up. And so, I mean, you could maybe describe this as a little bit of a V-shaped sound signature. The one caveat there is that V kind of, I don't know, for a lot of people implies a lot of treble. And as we'll get into in a little bit more detail, there's not a lot of treble emphasis here with the SSP, especially not like the mid and upper treble regions. But let's get into a little bit more detail here on the table. So maybe one other thing worth calling out while I've got you here is that surprisingly, I found that the SSP was actually a little bit harder to drive than the SSR, which was interesting. I do wonder if there maybe, you know, in addition to, well, in their tuning of this IM to get a little bit more bass out of it, maybe they had to do a little bit more damping or something in it, because it just seems like it's a little bit more inefficient than the SSR. And the SSR was already, as far as IEMs go, somewhat hard to drive. I mean, about as hard to drive as like an Etymotic, which is on the less sensitive side of IEMs. And I found with the SSP, it's actually even less sensitive than that. That said, I don't think you're gonna have any issues powering this thing off of most mobile phones or DAPs or anything like that. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. But let's go into a little bit more detail about the bass. So like I mentioned, you do get that wideband bass boost. If you look at this frequency response graph, that bass boost starts pretty early, like 400 hertz is where you start seeing that bass ramp up. And it does extend pretty well into the sub-bass frequencies. So it's not just like a one-note mid-bass kind of bloated, bumpy sound. It's actually a pretty decently textured bass, frankly. You know, it wasn't, the bass doesn't bleed into the mid-range in terms of like a smearing effect or anything like that. I think it's actually fairly well controlled, although, and maybe I'll get into this a little bit more when we get to the SSR comparisons, I did find that the bass on the SSR was maybe a little bit tighter and a little bit more controlled, versus here, I found it's solid, and again, it doesn't like smear up the mid-range, but it doesn't have quite the tightness that I find with the bass here on the SSR. And then we get into the mid-range, and like I mentioned, the upper mids here are basically the same upper mids that you're gonna get here on the SSR. The SSR is described very often as a shouty IEM, which is just to say that there's a lot of that upper mid-range lift. And that's true here, but you do get that bass response to balance it out. I do, despite the fact that there is that significant bass, I do find that the main mid-range character of this still comes through, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your taste. I really love this earphone, so for me, that's not a bad thing at all. I would describe the mid-range is a little bit on the thin side, maybe. Vocals can come across a little bit on the brittle side, but you know, overall, it did get a little bit more filled out because of that early bass boost, kind of starting in the 400 hertz range. That does fill out the mid-range a little bit, but still, again, I think the overall character of the SSR's mid-range, which again is a little bit on the thin side and a little bit on the brittle side, does carry over here with the SSP. And then we get to the treble, which is, I think, the part of the sound that, frankly, I like the least. And it's not necessarily that it's bad, but I did find it a little bit lackluster, frankly. So the lower treble region, it gets basically the same kind of carryover boost from the upper mid-range that you get on the SSR. Maybe a little bit less of that lower treble on the SSP, but at least in the frequency response. But I think what's kind of surprising is that, you know, I mentioned that significant bass increase didn't seem to significantly change the character of the mid-range, but I do find that, at least my suspicion is that bass boost is somehow crowding out the treble a little bit. So if you look at it in a frequency response graph, the treble matches pretty closely with what you get here on the SSR, but I did find that just in practice and listening to it, I found that the SSP just comes across as a little bit, darker is not quite the right word, but just a little bit less lively. There's, you know, the SSR is not the airiest sounding treble, but it's got, you know, enough of that mid-treble interest to keep the technicalities and sort of like the soundstage and layering and stuff very, very strong. Over here, I found with the SSP, it's a little bit more subdued. And this might get back to that suspicion that I have that they've, you know, maybe increased the damping in the SSP, that maybe that's affecting some of that treble character, where I find that just the treble versus the SSR can be a little bit on the dead sounding side, I guess. On the bright side, I mean, I didn't have any issues with sibilance, and that was likewise with the SSR. No issues with sibilance in either of these. But yeah, I did find that the treble here was, in my opinion, less interesting than the treble on the SSR. So now we can get into maybe a little bit more of these direct comparisons, even though I've kind of not really stopped comparing these things. But let's compare these things head to head. And I'll just say up front, my personal preference between these two is actually for the SSR. That said, I acknowledge that the tuning here on the SSR is a very niche tuning. It is weeby, you could say. It is very upper mid-range focused. It favors vocals, and even then, it favors vocals a little bit too much in that it can kind of mess with the timbre of vocals a little bit. It's a little thin sounding, but it's got a really good, I think, one, I really love the bass presentation here on the SSR. It's just got a nice punch that's very tight, very controlled, very focused, and doesn't interfere with the rest of the sound. The other thing that I really like about this is I guess the imaging, the definition between sounds and the spatial sort of representation of music, I think is really, really well done here on the SSR. On the SSP, that bass, again, there's more bass here, and it does extend better into the sub-bass frequencies. So for certain music, it can come across a lot better textured here, but generally I found that it was actually a little bit tighter and better controlled on the SSR. That said, if you consider yourself a bass head at all, you're gonna be more satisfied here with the bass on the SSP. But for my preferences, I thought that the bass was actually better executed on the SSR. And then the other thing is that because of that treble tuning on the SSP, and maybe I shouldn't even say tuning because it's frequency response wise, they're very, very similar, but whatever it is, whether it's the damping, whether it's the presence of that bass, I just found that the treble on here was a little bit lackluster versus the SSR, and the effect of that is that those sort of spatial cues that I get really well with the SSR don't come across as well on the SSP. It's still pretty well done. It is, I think, still a very, very tightly tuned or just well-controlled IEM generally, but I personally find it less engaging for at least the type of music that I listen to, and maybe we can get into a little bit of details about that music, but I personally find it a little bit less engaging. Anything else I should say about these things? I mean, I think it's worth reiterating that as much as this is my preference, I think this is the easier recommendation for most people. The only caveat with that is that I could say the same thing for some other IMs like the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus. I think if we were to bring in the T2 Plus into this equation, and imagine it sitting here, actually, there you go. You don't have to imagine it, it's sitting in a box. Here's the the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus. I think, again, of all these three IMs, the Moondrop SSR is my personal favorite. But I recognize that this tuning is a little bit niche and not for everybody. And so I think that these two are tuned more in a more mainstream way. But between these two, I prefer the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus. Now there's a lot of the physical characteristics of the SSP that I prefer over the T2 Plus, but just in terms of sound character, I think that the tonal balance is better here on the T2 Plus, which frankly I could probably say the same for the SSR. I think the tonal balance here is just a lot more normal. You're not going to have any weird sort of timbral intrusions or effects with the T2 Plus. And I think the bass tuning here is very solid. I think that, you know, versus these two, the bass here maybe has got a little bit more of a kick, and maybe the rumble is a little bit better on the SSP. But not a big difference there. And I think that more so it's just you get a better, I think you get better presentation in soundstage and imaging and sort of those other technical characteristics here with the T2 Plus versus the SSR. So between these three, you know, this is my preference. I think these two are the more mainstream tune. These are the easier recommendations. And between these two, I think that the T2 Plus is a little bit, yeah, that one's my preference, frankly. But again, a lot to like here about the build of the SSP. So, I mean, that is my review of the Moondrop SSP. I'll go ahead and give it a score. And out of 5 stars, I'll give it 1, 2, 3, 4 stars. I gave the SSR 5 stars because I really like it. I know, again, I don't know why I feel like I gotta keep caveating this, but the SSR tuning is definitely not for everybody. For me, it works pretty well. And then the technical aspects of it, just the other things outside of tuning, I really like with the SSR. Here with the SSP, I think they took a little bit of a hit there for, in exchange, a tuning that I think more people are gonna like. So that's what you got here. And again, the build quality here, a lot to love. Just one of my favorite fitting IMs, one of my favorite aesthetic IMs, frankly. And yeah, it's 40 bucks with a great cable. So that is the Moondrop SSP. If you're interested in checking this thing out, I do have links in the description down below. Full disclosure, as of the moment of this recording, if you're watching live, this thing's not available yet. This thing will be available on November 11th, I believe, for 40 bucks. So if you're watching this before then, wait for the link. If you're watching this after November 11th, 2020, look in the description for that link. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, please hit the like button. If you want to be part of the next super review, please subscribe to the channel, ding the bell. YouTube will let you know when I'm live next time, and I'll see you on the next super review.